this is Charlie from Vintage Speed. This will be our fourth in our series on rebuilding the Holley 94. We've got our carb completed, our base is installed, our jets are in it, power valves in it, and basically it's ready for testing. And I'm going to show you the procedure for testing. We like to use either paint thinner or mineral spirits to do our testing instead of using gasoline, due to the fact of the flammability of gasoline. So you put some fuel in your bowl and depress your pump lever, and you should get a positive squirt out of both of your squirter nozzles. You want a positive squirt out of both of those. If you operate your pump and you're getting a positive squirt, you're fine. Everything should be working good there. All right, now we're going to set this aside. Everything's ready there, and we're going to go to our top. You want to install your fuel valve, needle and seat. Although this is not a needle and seat, we use it's called a roto disc. It's a captured, and it uses a Teflon wafer instead of a needle with a Viton or a Buna rubber tip. The reason we like these is because they're resistant to the fuel. A lot of times you'll get your needle will come in and it'll be swollen up and it'll stick inside, and we've had them where you pull it off and the needle and the tip stays in the seat. This is due to the additives in the fuel today. This doesn't use rubber. It uses a Teflon wafer in there that shuts your fuel off, and we find these work much better. We have these for the Rochesters and the Holleys. So after your needle and seat's in, we're going to install our choke here. Now your choke has a little spring. We have these brand new. We also have the choke shafts brand new and all the choke parts and pieces. So the one end of it has a little 90-degree on it, and the other end has like a loop on it. You can see the little loop there, and that little loop goes over this part of it. So if you notice on the 94 and all your 3-bolt Holleys, there'll be a little slot right there. The choke shaft goes in. That piece with the 90-degree goes in that slot, and the other piece is wrapped around the arm of your choke here, so it spring loads your choke. So what you want to do is you want to pull this down to where it's vertical. In other words, spring load it down to where it's vertical, and then we want to install our butterfly. And our choke butterfly slides right in there like this. And if your screw holes line up, everything should be right, and this should be spring loaded like that. All right, on your choke shaft screws, and I mentioned this previously, that we don't, all of these screws for throttle plates and choke shafts has a little indented place in the end of them, and the original ones were bradded over, but what we do is we use red Loctite on them, and if you ever have to remove them, you need to take and just apply a little bit of heat to the screw, and then the screw can be removed. If you try to take the screw out without heating it, what'll happen is you'll break the screw off. This Loctite really locks them down tight. So just a little dab on the threads of the screw. And put it in. Okay, and your choke should work just like that. Okay, if you should, like I said, if you should have to take the Loctite out, we just use a regular propane torch like this and just stick the torch to the screws and heat them up a little bit, and then it'll soften the Loctite. It'll come out. Otherwise, don't try to take it out without heating them. If you do, you'll wring the screw off. Okay, now these use a little detent for your choke, and it has a spring here that goes in this hole, and the detent is a little detent ball that looks like that, and that goes over the spring. Now before you shove that way down in there, what you want to do is you want to make sure that it's spring loaded. Don't shove it all the way down in if it's getting tight, because what will happen is this will stick down in there, and this is hardened metal and it is a booger to get them out. So you want to make sure that it's spring loaded like this one is. You should have spring tension on it. Okay, then you can go ahead and put your choke arm on. Your choke arm has this little hole in it. Now this holds true to a cable choke or a ball choke. This particular carburetor is a model 59 and it's using a ball choke, so it just goes on there just like that. And there's a number 10 flat washer and a number 1032 by 1/4 inch Phillister head screw that goes on there. And you can snug this down tight because it rides in a flange. So that's the way your choke should work right there. Okay, now we're gonna install our gasket, and we're gonna install our float. And I mentioned this in another video, the way to test these floats. Get yourself a pan of boiling water, bring it to a boil, and then you don't need it even to be quite to a boil, but you don't want it boiling so hard that there's bubbles in it, just hot. Take your float and submerge your float down in it. Watch your float. If you don't see any bubbles coming off the float's good. If you see it, if it has any kind of minute leak in it, the bubbles will start coming out. And the way that works is the hot water heats the air inside the float and it causes it to expand, and it'll blow the air out of any little hole. A float's like a light bulb. It's either good or bad. An old one that don't leak is as good as a new one that does leak. So put your float in and insert your float pin. Sometimes on these Holleys you have to tap that float pin in. Okay, once your float's installed, we're gonna set the float. A lot of the kits you see will say that the float should be set 1 1/4 inches from the top gasket up to the top of the float. We find that these carburetors tend to flood at 1 1/4 inches. The minimum setting for them is 1 5/16 inches. You can do a measurement off of both sides of your float and to check and see that your float level is correct, or you can make yourself, if you're going to do it, you can make this out of cardboard. We've got this one for testing them. I made out of aluminum. And this is 1 5/16 inches from the base part to the top. So this makes it a lot easier if you make yourself a float gauge like that, because you can just set it on the carburetor and make sure it's true. You want to check the float on both sides to make sure it's not twisted from side to side. Assuming that your engine is fairly level and your carburetor is fairly level, 1 5/16 inches will usually keep any of your carburetors from having what we call thermal perk or hot start. If you find that you've got some down tilt to the back of your motor, what happens is this is the rear, so what it'll do is the fuel will load heavy to the cluster side, so you may have to raise this up another 1/16 of an inch. If you find you're getting boil over, and that's when you shut the car off, you can look down in and you'll see fuel dripping off the clusters. That's caused from the fuel being too high in the bowl. So you may have to raise the float, which shuts the fuel off sooner. So we have had some of these on where the engines were tilted, where we had to go as high as 1 3/8 to do it. On the float drop on this, there is a float drop setting. If you're using a standard needle and seat, you can pull it off of whatever it says in your kit. On the roto disc, you don't have to be concerned with float drop because the needle is captured. So all you need to do is just set this little tang right here so that the float drops down just far enough that you can look through that little window and see that the flap it comes down. So that's all you need. As long as that's open, you're fine. You don't have to worry about the float drop. Okay, we've got our choke in, we've got our carb, and we're ready to set our top on now. Everything's been tested. We're going to set our top down on the carburetor. And all the threads on Holley carburetors are fine thread. On the Stromberg carburetors, they're coarse thread. We have all these screws available. Now, we'll tell you this is not a screw that you can buy local. These screws are 5/8 of an inch long. If you go to a parts store and try to buy a screw to fit this, or if you bid it from even a house that sells bearings and bolts, generally they won't have these. These are special screws. The Holley 94 and the Stromberg 97 both use a 5/8 inch screw. The Holley 94 uses a 1032 Philister head fine by 5/8, and the Stromberg 97 uses a 1024 because they're coarse thread. So I like to put my top on, and I'm going to show you here on tightening the screws on the top. You never want to over tighten your top screws. What it'll do is it'll warp your top. So we'll find one here where I can show you. This one looks pretty good. Okay, on your lock washer, what you do is you tighten this down until your lock washer is compressed, and that's where the slit in your lock washer goes tight, and the screw will actually come to a stop. Okay, so we've compressed our lock washer. Once we've compressed our lock washer, we give it 1/4 of a turn, and that's all you need. So go ahead and put your top screws in. You'll feel the screw come to a stop once it compresses the washer. So once it compresses the washer, 1/4 of a turn. That's all you want. Okay. In the other video, I showed you this carburetor had an extended shaft on it. On this particular one, what we're doing is we're going to show you this model 59. Everything appears to be working fine. This particular model used a hand throttle on it. So I'm going to show you how this hand throttle works. You depress this, turn this 90 degrees and pull this off. And this piece rides down over the flange. If your carb has a hand throttle, you put the hand throttle spring on there. You put this back down, push it, turn it 90 degrees, and that should actuate your hand throttle. That's all that holds it on. Now the way the hand throttle works is, see, your main throttle don't move the lever, but when you operate your hand throttle, it does move your throttle. So a lot of the trucks were equipped with these, and the early passenger cars were equipped with hand throttles. Okay, I think that's pretty much got our 94 completed. In my last video, I'm going to show you putting this lever on. I'd already put it on this carburetor, but in the last video, I'm going to show you how to put that lever on. If you need any parts for it, we have an extensive parts supply, or you can call us at here in Florida, 772-778-0809. I'm Charlie. Or you can order these parts off our parts catalog on the web at www.vintagespeed.com. Thank you.